So it is no secret that vintage audio gear can provide you with high quality sound and performance relative to how much you pay out of your pocket. Now, with that being said though, the vintage audio world can be confusing as it ranges from mediocre gear that is not really worth your attention all the way to gear that is overhyped and collectibles that is probably too much asking for what it's worth. But thankfully, as some of you may know, vintage audio gear is a passion of mine and one of the main ways I got into the audiophile world. So in this video, I am going to reveal my top 6 hidden or not so hidden gems of the vintage audio world that you should definitely take a look at in 2021. So make sure to click that subscribe button and the bell notification so you don't miss anything, and let's get straight to it. So number 1 on the list is the Meitner STR-55 stereo amplifier. So this was designed by Ed Meitner. And Ed Meitner is a very respectable engineer that I personally respect very much. If you don't know about him, please do some reading on him. He is a very respectable individual and also as an engineer. Now, he runs a company called M Labs at the time, and still now he still does, I believe. And the components that he makes now are very expensive that I couldn't possibly purchase at the time. So I went ahead and looked for pieces that I could purchase, and that's why I came across the Meitner STR-55. The Meitner STR-55 is a 50 watt per channel into 8 ohms, and now that doesn't sound like a lot, but because of its superior power supply design that they call the floating charge power supply, it essentially allows to drive, kind of difficult to drive speakers like the KEF LS50s. And for a 50 watt amplifier, it is able to take on big dynamic swings, has great punch and great resolution, and a quiet background that really separates from its other vintage components. Because a lot of the vintage components does have that grain and it's not as resolute as the modern gear. But even comparing it to some of the modern gear in the market today, the Ed Meitner's STR-55 stereo amplifier really delivered clean, transient response. To give you an example, at the time I had a shit Vider amplifier as well. And comparing it directly side by side, the Vider was darker and warmer and richer sounding. However, the Meitner was definitely able to take on more bigger dynamic swings, even though it had less power, and it was transiently more superior. And my friend Tujin came over to listen to the KEF LS50s with the Vidar because I was selling it at the time because I liked the Meitner better. And he listened to the Vidar and he was intrigued by the beautiful wooden sleeve of the Meitner STR-55. It has this beautiful look. So he wanted to hear that. So I gladly accepted and switched the Ed Meitner STR-55, and he immediately fell in love with the STR-55 because he just loved the sound of it. And at the time, the Meitner was not expensive whatsoever. I got it for about 500 Canadian dollars. Now, it is pretty rare and it is rarely on the market, but if you do find one in good condition, it is definitely worth your while to check it out. Now, number 2 on the list is the Meitner MTR-101. So this was basically the monoblock version of the STR-55 that I just talked about, but this one has 100 watts into 8 ohms and it doubles into 4 ohms. So it's 200 watts into 4 ohms. And this one had tremendous more power than the STR-55 did. In fact, it was able to drive the Little Maggies. And even though it wasn't able to drive it to crazy loud levels, it definitely had drive and transience and clarity. And really, it was a very enjoyable experience to say the least. And to have 2 of these Ed Meitner designed monoblocks in your space, it looked gorgeous. I paired it up with multiple speakers from sensitive Tanois and JBLs to Paradigm at the time, and so on. And they all sounded extremely great. And one of the distinctive factor about these monoblocks were that they were able to have big dynamic swings for a relatively lower price point. Now, they do have a matching preamplifier called the PA6i, I believe, and I had those as well with both the STR-55 and the MTR-101s. Now, they do offer, I think they still do, offer upgrades, and I did upgrade my MTR-101 at one point in time, and the sound got even better. It was more airier, more dynamic swing, more crispiness, and so I definitely recommend the upgrade. The upgrade is done by John Wright, who used to work with Ed Meitner. And this was even a much more high current design than the STR-55 because it had 35 instead of 10 peak output current. Number 3 on the list is going to be the Dynaco ST-70. Now, this is not so much, as unknown as the Meitner, I should say. It's fairly well known, but it's one of those pieces that people often overlook or, think that it's not as good. It is extremely good. The Dynaco ST-70 came out around 1959, I believe, and it was offered in a kit version. So a lot of people built this. So the first thing that you want to look at when you look at a Dyna kit, which is what they call it, is finding out if it actually was assembled properly with care and by someone who knew what they were doing. But most of these pieces last a very long time and they sound fabulous. They use 2 pairs of EL34 output tubes, and these tubes give you that classic EL34 sound. It has very, very rich mids, very, very airy highs, and it gives you that tubiness that you really look for. And in fact, the Dynaco ST-70 was one of the tube amplifiers that really drew me into the tube world. It sounds really great, especially if it's your first time with tubes. Definitely consider it. It gives you that classic tube sound with the EL34 tubes. And if you really wanted to, you can add the Millard, not the reissue, but the vintage Millard tubes. They're quite expensive depending on the condition and all that. But if you come across those, definitely consider switching to those because that gives you a much smoother and enjoyable tube experience. Now the power rating is not much. It's about 35 watts per channel. So you may have to, use sensitive speakers, but for most small to medium sized rooms, I would say it works with, mid to sensitive, speakers. I wouldn't pair these up with the KEF LS50s or MagnaPens for that matter. But definitely, if you're into tubes and starting out, definitely take a look at the Dynaco ST-70 because it's relatively cheap on the market and it can be readily found as many of these kits were readily available at the time. Now moving on to number 4 on the list is going to be the Pioneer SX1980. So this is a monster receiver. So for those of you that don't know, there's like Sensui, Pioneer, but these were one of my first monster receivers. And I remember this being so good with my JBL L100 Century speakers and the 4311s. It just sounded so dynamic, so crisp, so impactful, and it was just a very enjoyable, sweet experience. Now, the first thing that I realized with this receiver was that it had tremendous clarity, yet the high frequency was never bright, and it was sparkly, and that's when I first learned the term sweet sounding. The high frequency was just so sweet. And for those of you that haven't experienced that yet, try to find a Pioneer SX1980. Now, there's other offerings like Sensui AU717 and other integrated amplifiers or vintage gear that does offer this sweet sound And you can find that with tube amplifiers as well. But when you have that pairing just right, in the case with the JBL speakers and the Pioneer, it just sounded very, very sweet. It was introduced in the late 70s and it has a rating of 270 watts per channel into 8 ohms. That is a lot of power. And this receiver, by the way, I was able to lift it by myself at the time, which is kind of crazy because this is 100 pounds. I don't think I can do that. I was moving it up and down the stairs at the time, but it was 100 pounds. It's very heavy. Now, when you get a receiver like this, sometimes you do need to refurbish it and change a little bit of the capacitors and stuff to be in spec. But when you do, it just sounds absolutely fabulous, and you should definitely consider checking it out. Now, the price on these units, I got it for around, I want to say 1,500 Canadian dollars to 2,000 Canadian dollars at the time, which was definitely worth it for me. But I think the price has gotten a little bit crazy on some units, so watch out for pricing on that. If the pricing is too high on any of these units, guys, don't purchase it. Be mindful. But when the price is right, definitely worth your consideration. Now, number 5 on the list is going to be the Marantz 8B. Now, this is a tube amplifier, and it's going to be a little bit of a pricey one. Now, it is a EL34 design, just like the Dynaco ST70 I was talking about, but it's going to be, a little bit better. It's going to be smoother, more airier, and the price is going to be a little bit more expensive. It's going to be around 3,000 to 5,000 Canadian dollars, and the price range varies obviously depending on how much the seller wants. But at the time, I think I paid about 2,000, 3,000 Canadian dollars, and it sounded extremely good with my JBL speakers, Tannoy speakers, sensitive speakers, because this doesn't have a lot of power. It has about 30 to 35 watts per channel into 8 ohms. And essentially, they made a monoblock version, the Model 5, I believe. And this was basically those amplifiers into just one chassis. They weigh around 50 to 60 pounds, so they are a pretty hefty tube amplifier. And it was introduced in the late 1950s, I want to say. And they were a direct competition to high-end Macintosh, MC240 tube amplifier, and the Citation by Harman, and so on. So very respectable tube amplifier for sure. I'm glad I got to own it. Oh, and one last thing. There is the Marantz 8, I believe, and then the 8B, which was the one that I owned. And that is the preferred version because the B stands for biasing, and it had, basically an easy way where it had a meter on the side, which allowed you to bias just like you would on some of the Wilsonton, tube amplifiers that I reviewed. So it was a very easy biasing process. So you didn't have to go inside the amplifier to actually bias it. So definitely worth your consideration if the price is right, and very important if the price is right, and if your budget is a little bit higher. But if it's not, I think that most of you will be happy with the Dynaco ST70, especially if this is your first stab into the vintage audiophile world. Now, number 6 on the list, last but not the least, is going to be the Kenwood L-07m monoblock amplifiers. So this is a piece that I currently own, and I've owned, I think, two of these in the past, and this is my 3rd time owning it, I believe. Yeah. And this is an interesting piece because I keep coming back to it, and there's one guy on my Patreon, and he just loves this to death. He actually, kind of repairs and stuff like that. And, I'm going to probably send my pairs to him to work on it. But it's such a unique piece because not many people know about it, at least in my opinion. I haven't seen too many people talk about it. But it matches very well with multiple different speakers. It is a very, very interesting design because it's DC direct design. It has very good current capability, and it has very good drive to the sound. It's snappy, punchy, and it doesn't have as much grain as some of the other vintage amplifiers. It almost, I would say that it is very comparable to a lot of the modern gear in terms of the dynamic swing. And for a price that you pay, which I paid about $800 for the pair, and that's Canadian dollars, that is insane for a monoblock. Now, obviously, you do have to, kind of go in there and change the capacitors to bring it back to spec and stuff like that. But right now, I haven't done that, and it's in extremely good condition. It sounds incredibly good, and even compared to a lot of the modern gear, it has very good dynamic swing and really capable sound. And it does have that kind of military look to it because it's kind of green on the chassis. But at least it's not nasty green. It looks pretty, luxurious green in my opinion. It's about 30 pounds each. It's a Class AB design, 150 watts per channel into 8 ohms. And it has very good signal to noise ratio. It was introduced in the early 90s, and this was designed by Accuphase engineers when Accuphase or Kenwood was known as the Kensonic Laboratory. So in a lot of people's minds, and including mine, these pieces the L series were one of the best of its kind. And I can definitely attest to that, and definitely worth a look, because compared to the very expensive Accuphase pieces that you see today, it gives you a lot more for your money. That's for sure. So definitely take a look at that. And that concludes my top six, secret gems of the vintage world. I hope this helps you out, and if it did, please give this video a big thumbs up, and I hope to make more of these videos. I have a lot more hidden gems or not so hidden gems of the vintage audio that you may have not heard about before and would definitely like to hear about. So let me know how you think about this video in the description below, and I'll see you guys on the next one.